Hello there, friends. Today I rode my bike out to the beautiful Noisette Creek. The no-see-ums are out, so please don't mind me as I deal with them. And I will admit it's a little bit windy today, and we're in a wide open area, so if there's a little bit of background noise, I can only apologize. But without any further ado, today I'll be sharing an article with you from Harvard Business Review's 10 must-reads on communication. Here is the book. The title of this article caught my attention. That's why I decided it might catch yours too. Maybe it's something to share. The title is a question, and it asks, is silence killing your company? It's written by Leslie Perlow and Stephanie Williams, and as always, I'll share a little bit about the two authors, and then we'll jump into the article. Leslie Perlow is the Konosuke Matsushita Professor of Leadership at Harvard Business School. And Stephanie Williams is a principal at North Star Consulting and a former Harvard Business School Research Associate. Now, this article, I believe, was written in 2003, so I imagine neither of those ladies still hold those posts. But in any case, let me jump into the article. Is silence killing your company? Silence is associated with many virtues: modesty, respect for others, prudence, decorum. Thanks to deeply ingrained rules of etiquette, people silence themselves to avoid embarrassment, confrontation, and other perceived dangers. In fact, there's an old saying that sums up the virtues of silence. Better be quiet and thought a fool than to talk and be known as one. The wind almost blew over the camera. Let's see if we can hang on. If it gets too wild, I may have to retreat to a more sheltered location. The social virtues of silence are reinforced by our survival instincts. Many organizations send the message, verbally or non-verbally, that falling into line is the safest way to hold on to our jobs and further our careers. I see the camera wobbling all over the place. The need for quiet submission is exaggerated by today's difficult economy, where millions of people have lost their jobs and many more worry that they might soon. A Dilbert cartoon poignantly expresses how pointless and perilous many feel it is to speak out. For any of you that don't know, Dilbert is one of those little cartoons that they show in newspapers, and it's always about office and management, that sort of thing. Dilbert, the everyman underling, recognizes that a senior executive is making a terrible decision. Shouldn't we tell her? He asks his boss, who laughs cynically. Yes, the boss replies. Let's end our careers by challenging a decision that won't change. That's a great idea. To be sure, people who speak out sometimes get their day in the sun. Sharon Watkins of Enron, Cynthia Cooper of WorldCom, and Colleen Rowley at the FBI all ended up on the cover of Time as Persons of the Year. But keep in mind, this article was written in 2003, so they are not familiar names to us in our day and age. The authors continue, but public recognition of a few people does not mean that speaking out is necessarily viewed as courageous or praiseworthy. Most individuals who go against their organizations or express their concerns publicly are severely punished. If they are not fired outright, they are usually marginalized and made to feel irrelevant. But it is time to take the guilt off silence. Our research shows that silence is not only ubiquitous and expected in organizations, but extremely costly to the firm and to the individual. Our interviews with senior executives and employees in organizations ranging from small businesses to Fortune 500 corporations to government bureaucracies reveal that silence can exact a high psychological price on individuals, generating feelings of humiliation, pernicious anger, resentment, and the like that, if unexpressed, contaminate every interaction, shuts down creativity, and undermines productivity. Take the case of Jeff, a team leader at a Fortune 100 company who is working on a large, long-term, high-pressure project. Each Tuesday, Jeff and his peers had a project management meeting, PMM, with Matt, their boss. Jeff would start writing his weekly update reports on Wednesday, continuing to work on them when he had time on Thursday and Friday, working even into the weekend. And on Monday morning, he would hand in his document to Matt. Jeff figured that a weekly update would probably be useful for Matt. All the same, he felt deeply frustrated at the time that he was wasting writing these elaborate reports. Yet, despite complaining endlessly to his peers week after week, Jeff said nothing to Matt. With each act of silence, Jeff's resentment grew and his respect for Matt disintegrated. Alright everyone, it simply got too windy, too gusty out there on the water, and the camera started shaking and the bike fell over, and so I decided I'll finish up this article at home, which is where I am now. Not quite sure exactly how I'm going to splice this together or where I cut off, but essentially Jeff was getting extremely frustrated with the situation, but he simply didn't say anything. He complained to his peers but didn't say anything to Matt, his boss. And so the process continued as the project fell further behind schedule. Now, for his part, when Matt, his boss, was asked about the value of the PMM, this meeting, he was mystified. Not to insult my team leaders, but in my mind, every Tuesday morning I have a painfully meaningless meeting. That's what he called the PMM. The fact that no one suggested an alternative to the PMM is fairly typical of our findings. Individuals are frequently convinced that keeping quiet is the best way to preserve relationships and get work done. In the following pages, we will examine what makes this sort of silence so prevalent in organizations. From there, we will discuss the personal and organizational costs of silence, which often remain hidden for long periods of time, even as they grow exponentially with each additional act of silence. Finally, we will investigate several ways to break free from the insidious silent sink. The reign of silence. Silence often starts when we choose not to confront a difference. Given the dissimilarities in our temperaments, backgrounds, and experiences, it's inevitable that we will have different opinions, beliefs, and tastes. Now, most of us recognize the value of such variety. I mean, who really wants to go into a brainstorming session with people who all have the same views and ideas? But we're also aware of how terribly painful it can be to raise and work through differences. The French word différent tellingly means quarrel. Not surprisingly, most people decide it's easier to cover up their differences than to try to discuss them. Now, I'll insert a piece of my own philosophy in here. I've always been taught from a very young age that there are 4 things you should never discuss in the workplace. And those 4 things are politics. Well, of course, unless your job is politics, unless you are a representative or minister or governor or something. If politics isn't your job, don't discuss politics. Number 2 is religion. Again, unless your job is religion, you shouldn't discuss it in the workplace. Number 3 is drugs. Unless, well, I suppose if you're a drug dealer, then I suppose your job is to discuss drugs. But that's not something that you should discuss in a typical work. Say if you're an accountant or a biologist or something, you shouldn't be discussing that. And 4th is sex. Again, if you're a sex therapist or a marriage counselor or something, that maybe that comes into play. But if you're a pharmacist or an engineer, those are the 4 things that you should avoid in all professional settings, with your colleagues, with your clients, with your customers, etc. However, this is not the differences that this article is referring to. This is strictly professional differences and opinions on how things should be run and managed. Anyway, continuing, most people decide it's easier to cover up their differences than to try to discuss them. Our research shows that this tendency to remain silent rather than express a difference exists both in individual relationships and in groups, where we fear a loss of status or even expulsion if we differ from the rest. Most of us can remember from our adolescence how compelling the desire was to conform. Even as adults, many people in organizations are willing to go to enormous lengths to get along with members of their work groups, at least superficially. We do what we believe other group members want us to do. We say what we think other people want us to say. Consider what happened at one off-site meeting of top management at a web-based education company. Concerned about the company's vision, the managers all met to share and discuss different perspectives. But one speaker after another just echoed what the previous speaker had said. When any manager did dare to dissent, a colleague would quickly jump in and dismiss the idea. Having effectively tabled every discussion in which disagreement surfaced, the management team crowed about the level of consensus that they had achieved. One by one, team members celebrated their achievement. The head of marketing went first. "We made some great progress today," he said. "I'm excited, passionate, committed to the future." The CFO continued. "I thought today was going to be a lot uglier. I expected battles, yet things were remarkably consistent." Yet despite the outward expression of consensus, at the end of the day, many of the attendees privately despaired that the entire meeting was a huge waste of time. By silencing themselves and others, they failed to create a compelling vision. And the company continued with no clear direction. Or I'll add, perhaps not really no clear direction, but not a direction in which options and alternatives were honestly discussed. Towards the end of this article, they will share some advice on how to break free of this. This meeting shows how the pressure for unanimity can prevent employees of roughly equal grade and status, even top managers, from exploring their differences. More familiar to many is the pressure to keep silent that's created by differences in rank. How easy it is for a boss to send a powerful signal that a worker should be quiet. Take the case of Robert and Linda. Robert was an attorney in charge of his law firm's support staff. Linda, who was head of the library, came to Robert one day to complain about the performance evaluation process. She felt that many of the lawyers weren't being fair in their evaluations of library staff, and that they shouldn't have the automatic right to determine the librarians' raises and promotions. Robert disagreed. If you think of the lawyers as your clients, he advised, you can see why they have every expectation to be able to critique the quality of service. When Linda pressed again, Robert got irritated and said, "This is the way we do it around here, and this is the way it's going to continue." Linda said nothing more and quietly left his office. Now, at least Linda tried to speak up. Many members of organizations silence themselves before the boss has even the slightest inkling of what they're thinking. Often in these instances, employees use silence as a strategy to get ahead. Consider Don, a senior analyst at an investment bank who carefully keeps his opinions to himself, especially when he's around his superiors. It comes down to the hierarchical nature at the bank, he says. Basically, you're just trying to make the person above you love you, so you'll get a big bonus. If you start raising uncomfortable questions and being holier than thou, you may be absolutely right, but you shoot yourself in the foot. What the managing director says goes. And it's not just that subordinates feel pressure to keep silent with their bosses. Bosses also may feel uncomfortable expressing their differences with subordinates. It is frequently difficult for managers, for instance, to give negative performance feedback to subordinates, especially in organizations that place a high value on being polite and avoiding confrontation. The costs of suffering in silence. When we silence ourselves and others, even when we're convinced that it is the best way, the right way, or the only way to preserve the relationships we care about and get on with our work, we may be fooling ourselves. Let's return for a moment to the law firm where Robert and Linda worked. After meeting with Linda, Robert simply forgot about their discussion. As a senior partner, he thought his view was a no-brainer, and he assumed that the issue would just go away. Linda, for her part, was acutely aware that she had been forced into silence. But given that Robert was the boss, she thought the best course was to say nothing further to him. Still, she was profoundly angry. In an attempt to release her negative feelings, she complained bitterly to her peers about what Robert had said and how he had shut her down. But gossiping only alleviated Linda's anger temporarily, and news of Robert's insensitivity quickly spread throughout the support staff, which came to view the incident as evidence that management doesn't listen. Ultimately, Robert's strained relations with the support staff led to high turnover. As he later reflected, "My action that day was probably the single greatest mistake I ever made." The damage wasn't just to Robert and the organization. Linda, in choosing to respond to Robert with silence, caused herself great damage as well, far more in fact than she may have realized. That's because silencing doesn't resolve anything. Rather than erase differences, it merely pushes them beneath the surface. Every time we keep silent about our differences, we swell with negative emotions like anxiety, anger, and resentment. Of course, we can go on for a long time pretending to ourselves and others that nothing is wrong. But as long as the conflict is not resolved, our repressed feelings remain potent and color the way we relate to other people. We begin to feel a sense of disconnection in our relationships, which in turn causes us to become increasingly self-protective. When we feel defensive in this way, we become all the more fearful that if we speak up, we will be embarrassed or rejected. Our sense of insecurity grows. In relationships, we care about preserving. More acts of silence follow, which only bring more defensiveness and more distrust. A destructive spiral of silence is set in motion. Caught up in just such a spiral was Maria, a project manager we interviewed at a management consulting firm. At the beginning of her first project, her boss, Max, suggested to Maria ways her team could make its initial presentation to the client. Maria wasn't convinced that Max's approach was the best. But Max was the partner, so Maria kept her concerns to herself. Later, when Max discovered that the team had failed to collect some of the data he wanted, he lost his temper and ordered Maria to push the team harder. Maria thought that the data was irrelevant and that searching for them would just waste the team's time. But, inwardly clenching her fists and gritting her teeth, she deferred to her superior. A few days later, Maria and her team received a lukewarm response when they presented their findings to the client. Maria later met with Max to discuss the next steps. Convinced that she understood the client's needs better than he did, she was intent on laying out her own point of view and explaining to him the error in his approach. But Maria had become increasingly uncomfortable around Max, so when he launched into a critique of her team's performance, she lost her nerve. Again, she stifled her resistance and opted to do as Max said. Maria's discomfort grew each time she chose to remain silent, and she descended down the spiral of silence. Ultimately, her desire and ability to work with Max were destroyed. There's a cruel and all too common irony here. For the reason Maria had silenced herself in the first place was to preserve her relationship with Max. We don't speak up for fear of destroying our relationships, but in the end, our silence creates an emotional distance that becomes an unbridgeable rift. That's what happened to Shoni, a research fellow in pulmonary and critical care medicine. When we interviewed him, he had already discovered where the spiral leads. Pravin, a research associate 1 level higher, was supposed to oversee Shoni's work. In exchange, Pravin's name would appear on everything Shoni published. Eager to maximize Shoni's productivity, Pravin constantly issued him instructions. Shoni resented being bossed around, but always did as he was told, never pushing back. Over time, however, Shoni's resentment grew as Pravin continued to treat him more like an unknowing assistant than a highly qualified peer. One day, when Pravin started to question Shoni about how he had spent his time in the lab the previous evening, something inside Shoni snapped. He still said nothing. But from that day forth, Shoni refused to collaborate with Pravin. On their next assignment, they divided the tasks and carried them out independently. So much for teamwork, huh? But, story continues, but that just made things worse. By shutting himself off, Shoni lost the opportunity to brainstorm with an informed colleague. He also precluded the possibility of sharing anything he may have learned that could have helped Pravin, and he foreclosed on any potential for eliminating redundancy in the two researchers' work. Silencing was not only costly to Shoni, but it was a cost doubly borne, for the organization paid it as well. Each time workers remain silent in the face of conflict, they keep new ideas to themselves and leave alternative courses of action unexplored. And they withhold important information from colleagues that could enhance the quality of both their own and the organization's work. The next section: breaking the spiral of silence. How do we get ourselves and others to speak up? Can the vicious spirals of silence be replaced with virtuous spirals of communication? The answer is yes. But doing so requires that we find the courage to act differently, and that we create the context in which people will value the expression of such difference. Managers with a lot of authority need to be especially careful not to punish people, explicitly or implicitly, for speaking out, particularly on issues that may be difficult in the organization to deal with. Harry's case illustrates how a leader can create such a context. Harry was a battalion commander whose unit of more than 500 soldiers had just been miserably defeated in a mock battle against another unit. If this had been a real battle, 2/3 of us would be dead, Harry said to the unit in the debriefing that followed. But he continued, "I was at fault. I failed you." And he went on to explain exactly how, taking full responsibility for the failure. At first, no one said a word. Then Nick, a very junior scout who was responsible for detecting and alerting the battalion to the enemy's movement, said, "No, sir, it wasn't your fault. I fell asleep on duty." Harry was shocked, but rather than focus on Nick's failure, great as it was, Harry immediately redirected the unit's attention to uncovering the underlying problem: the exhaustion his men were suffering. How many had also slept through the opening rounds of the attack? He asked his soldiers to think to themselves. "Nick is a good soldier," he said. "All of you are good soldiers. We need to focus on the bigger issue. How can we sustain our capabilities during continuous operations in such high-intensity situations?" Harry set the tone for this discussion. Had he not started by exhibiting his own failures, it's highly unlikely that Nick would have had the courage to speak up. Moreover, Harry carefully framed the ensuing discussion to avoid blame and instead focus on the larger problem they all faced. In the end, this unit gained a rich appreciation for the importance of speaking up and admitting mistakes. Keeping quiet is too big a problem to be left just to leaders, however. If an organization wants to escape the spiral of silence, everyone has to fight the urge to withdraw and has to work hard to speak up. That's a tough challenge for all the reasons we've explored, but the following practices can help. The authors will share their 3 practices. I'll read the titles and then we'll go through them one by one. Number 1 is recognize your power. Number 2, act deviantly. And number 3, build a coalition. Those are the 3. Recognize your power, act deviantly, and build a coalition. Let's go through the first one, recognize your power. We all have the power to express ourselves and to encourage others to speak freely, whether they're subordinates, peers, or even bosses. Of course, nobody likes to be the one to break the ice. In the face of personal conflict, passivity always feels safer than action. Who would prefer not to sit back, blame the other person, and wait for him to make the first move? Yet, it's almost never the case that something is entirely another person's fault. Instead of waiting for the other person to apologize or to broach the subject, we need to be willing to take the first step ourselves, to bring differences out into the open so that they can be explored. This can be a good strategy for dealing with a boss who has overtly silenced a subordinate, like Robert from the law firm. In that situation, Linda could have chosen to go back to Robert to try to turn the situation around. She could have met with him again and said something like, "I know you don't think that the issue with the performance evaluation process is important, but it is very important to the library staff, and we would like you to understand our point of view. I don't feel comfortable dropping the issue, as you suggested. I would like a chance to better explain my perspective." When one person finds the courage to take a step like this and presents new information in a way that the other person can absorb, the two are likely to join in a process of mutual exploration of the differences that separate them. Indeed, we all have much more power than we think. Our superiors certainly have formal power over us, but it is also true that their performance depends on how well we are doing. Don't forget, your boss needs you too. And knowing that should empower you to speak up and help them appreciate your point of view. The second one, act deviantly. To break the walls of silence, sometimes we have to behave in ways that are not considered appropriate for our particular organization. Put differently, we must act deviantly. For example, by choosing to ask tough questions at a company meeting where employees normally just accept the decisions of top management. Although deviance often carries negative connotations, it is not synonymous with dysfunctionality. Deviance is, at heart, a creative act, a way of searching out and inventing new approaches to doing things. Acts of deviance can point to areas where organizations need to change and can result in fruitful alternatives. The chief thing to keep in mind here is that norms can have exceptions. By challenging a particular norm, we can play a role in changing it. The third advice: build a coalition. Reaching out to others can give us the strength to break the hold of silence. Not only is it easier to speak up when we know we're not alone, but a coalition also carries more legitimacy and resources. Even though it may feel threatening to approach people to join forces with you, it is surprising how often you may find that many people feel the same way that you do. That's what happened to Nancy Hopkins, a scientist at MIT. Hopkins repeatedly found herself having to fight harder than her male colleagues for resources like lab space. After dealing with the same issues for years, she drafted a letter to the MIT administration. Before sending it, however, she showed it to a female colleague who she regarded as politically savvy. To Hopkins' surprise, the other woman wanted to add her signature to the letter. The same type of things had happened to her too. In the end, 14 of the 15 women Hopkins approached decided to sign as well. As a result, a committee was formed, and a pattern of discrimination was uncovered and addressed. We have recently seen the scandals at, and I will remind you all, this article was originally published in 2003. We've recently seen the scandals at Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom, to name but a few, just how catastrophic situations can become when silence prevails. Yet silence does not have to be about fraud and malfeasance to do grave damage to a company. All too often, behind failed products, broken processes, and mistaken decisions are people who chose to hold their tongues rather than to speak up. Breaking the silence can bring an outpouring of fresh ideas from all levels of an organization. Ideas that might just raise the organization's performance to a whole new level. Hopefully you found that to be a thought-provoking article. Thank you.